So you all are in for a big treat because I'm here with Dr. Anthony Pinn. So, Anthony, how would you describe your expertise?
Well, my training is in the study of religion with a particular focus on African American religion. But exploring African American religion led me to another interest, and that interest is humanism. So for the past 20 years or so, I've been looking at the ways in which humanism develops within the context of the United States. What humanism is as a mode of thought, how it's practiced, what it means in terms of community formation.
Now, from my understanding of the term humanism, it encompasses a lot. It encompasses what we might call atheism, agnosticism, non-religion, secularity. So how do you define humanism when you use that term?
You're absolutely right. It's something of a fluid concept. But when I talk in terms of humanism, this is what I mean. I mean a philosophy of life without belief in God or gods that holds the human fully accountable and responsible for the conditions of life. It entails an ethics or a sense of what we ought to do in the world that doesn't assume any sort of external help. It's humans trying to make their way through the world in relationship to other forms of life.
Great. So the title of this video is Church of the Godless. It's a kind of provocative title, and I would love the audience to understand, what do you mean by Church of the Godless? What is a Church of the Godless?
What this idea of church for the godless really boils down to, what it gets at is a growing concern within humanist and atheist circles for an opportunity, a structure for the development of community, for relationships, ritualizing life, an opportunity to think through and celebrate high points of life, and an opportunity to mourn with others the low points of life, to, in essence, make life meaningful.
So we just got back with a meeting with a member of one of these communities. Could you tell us a little bit about this community?
Well, we spent some time with leadership from Houston Oasis. It's one of these communities that started with a group of like-minded folks who left Christian churches but still recognized the need to get together, that for them ritual was not a bad word. And they needed a way to ritualize life that was true to their non-theistic sensibilities. So they started gathering. And the idea being that there ought to be a way to share music they love, readings they love, to help folks make it through life, and to do this in a way that was consistent and that was consistent and sustainable. For them, this took the form of a church without God.
And this movement is coming at a particular moment in U.S. history in particular, where you have the rise of the so-called nuns, N-O-N-E-S, nuns, meaning the people that check the non-affiliated box in the question, what is your religion or your religious identity on a census? So could you speak to a little bit of this speak to the rise of this new so-called nun identity and how this plays into this movement?
Sure, it's fascinating. So Houston Oasis is roughly a decade old, but we've noticed for longer than a decade a shift in the religious sensibilities of the U.S. population. And we've reached a point where it's undeniable that a growing percentage of the U.S. population claims no particular religious affiliation. None, the nuns. But this is an interesting population in that they have troubled our language about religion. So, for example, within this population, you'll get some who claim that they are spiritual but atheist. That takes a little work.
Yeah, how does that work?
To hold those together. So what we've come to understand is that these are folks for whom traditional forms of religiosity, including belief in God, just doesn't work. Those forms don't work. But it doesn't mean they've given up a desire to be together, to recognize relationships, that even without God, they understand that life has wonder and awe. And they're developing alternate ways to express that. One of the ways that received a great deal of attention for a minute is Sunday assemblies, which is often described as Pentecostalism for atheists. Houston Oasis is another model that again tries to take the best of traditional forms of gathering, of respecting and appreciating conscious use of time and space, right? They come together with intent to recognize more than separation of church and state and science education, to recognize what one might call the soft and essential dimensions of life. And they deserve some attention. We really ought to understand what's going on there.
That's what I find most interesting about these organizations, these gatherings. Like when you think of like atheist activists in the United States, you do often think of their activism for the separation of church and state, or for redefining science curricula, and in a state like Texas, where sometimes this is very controversial with like maybe a conservative Christian influence on science curriculum. But these communities are focused on maybe more down-to-earth things like, raising a child. How do you raise a child in a humanist family? And other, so-called life cycle rituals, things that we talk about in religious studies. So what's the religious studies angle here? Because we wouldn't necessarily call this religion, or would we? Like, this is kind of playing with this category.
One of the things I find fascinating about Houston Oasis and similar gatherings is that they force us to interrogate our language, to interrogate the kinds of assumptions that come into play in the study of religion. So, for example, we've tended to think about religion with respect to gods and God, and the kind of doctrinal structures and structures of worship and creedal structures growing out of this. But there are other ways to think about religion, right? And if you boil it down, religion is really about a binding together. It doesn't require God or gods, right? So there's every reason to think about Houston Oasis or Sunday assemblies as a godless religiosity. That is to say, an effort to make life meaningful, to kind of wrestle with the fundamental questions of our existence. Who are we? What are we? When are we? Why are we? Without a strict reliance on the scientific method, right? To kind of recognize there are other dimensions of who we are that are not fully captured through objective study. And I think that's important for us. It also forces us to rethink how we understand the godless, right? We tend to understand them only in terms of their public protest. Take down that cross, remove that Bible imagery, and forget that these are folks who have to figure out how to raise their kids, right? These are folks who have to wrestle with what it means to bury loved ones, right? That there are more dimensions of life, and that these come into play, and we ought to give some attention to what these mean. There's also a shift taking place in the United States, and the study of religion ought to be given some attention to what this shift entails and what this means concerning the practice and understanding of religion moving forward.
So a final question for us to really, we've been talking the abstract somewhat, especially with the concept of category, interrogation. What do we mean by religion? These are academic questions. So let's bring this a little bit down to the real world.
So we might think in terms of, well, there are areas of the country where you might think this sort of develop as natural, right? So you would not be, you wouldn't be thrown by this sort of development taking place in California or the Northeast.
Yeah, Boston.
But how widespread is this, right? Has it really impinged on life in the Bible Belt, for example, right? How widespread is this?
Yeah. And can you speak to that? I mean, we're in Houston right now, so you would assume, I mean, there's a high Christian population here, but yet Houston Oasis, from what we've just discovered chatting with the leadership, is it's actually kind of a large group. I forget exactly the number she gave, but it's not like this is a small gathering. But what's the nationwide or maybe global scope of this movement?
It's grown. So if we think about this in terms of a European context, if you think in terms of places like Germany or the UK, there's a different public understanding with respect to religion. So there are ways in which those communities are nurtured and understood, and the United States is playing catch up. But what I would say is that these sorts of developments in the United States are not geographically stifled. That is to say, they are not restricted to one area of the country, right? They're not restricted to those ultra liberal areas of the country. That throughout the United States, you have these sorts of movements taking place. So you're absolutely right. You think about Texas, you think about Houston, you think about big churches, and those do exist here. But you have humanist and atheist organizations and that are doing community work, who understand humanism as a call to be engaged in the world. But then you have an organization like Houston Oasis with a pretty good population, roughly 70 consistently showing up on a Sunday, who are arguing that, yes, this public work is vital, but we also have to give some attention to the nurturing of relationships. We have to give some attention to being together.
So a final question would be, what's next? What's next for your research on this, and where do you see this movement going? Because from everything that I've read, from organizations like Pew Research, the so-called nuns demographic is growing, especially among the younger generations. So we could, possibly make a prediction that this sort of movement will become more vital in the coming years.
I want to keep my eyes open and kind of explore what's taking place here, because it ebbs and flows. So, for example, Sunday assemblies hot for a stretch, and in certain locations struggling a bit. But I think what we need to be mindful of is, on a more baseline level, those who don't believe in God are looking for ways to form community. And they will do that sensitive to context and need. I think it is safe to say that within the context of the United States, the way communities develop, the needs they nurture, the kind of language they make use of will never be the same. And when folks say the United States is a Christian nation, they'll have to put a question mark at the end of that.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for your time, Anthony. This was really interesting research, and I am excited to see where this goes, because it seems to be such a dynamic field.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed chatting.
Great.